The 121st New York State Volunteer Regimental Association dedicated this in 1889. The four-sided Quincy granite monument measures 6 feet square. It goes up 7 feet, and then it's surmounted by a soldier in bronze of another 7 feet. The monument sits precisely in the center of the line held by the 121st on Little Round Top. The front face bears the inscription, 121st New York Infantry, Colonel Emory Upton, 2nd Brigade, 1st Division, 6th Corps, held this position from the evening of July 2nd until the close of battle. And in bronze are the cross of the 6th Corps and the coat of arms of the state of New York. On the reverse side, facing Sykes Avenue, along the crest of Cemetery Ridge, is the bronze bas-relief of Emory Upton, the regiment's most famous commander. On the other side are 2 bronze tablets. One lists the names of the battles the 121st participated in. There were 25 in all, from Crampton's Gap in 1862 to Appomattox in 1865. But the other gives a brief history of the regiment in cold, hard numbers. 226 killed or mortally wounded, 623 wounded, 121 died of disease, 320 discharged for wounds, 274 transferred to other command. They mustered out 25 officers and 283 enlisted for a total of 308. They left upstate New York in 1862 with almost 1,000 men. You realize, you're struck by this disparity of numbers, but you also realize that it's the only memorial for the 121st for the entire 3 years of service. Despite the regiment's participation in 25 officially recognized battles, there is no monument to them on any other battlefield. The irony is that this particular monument's placement is that although the 121st was at Gettysburg, it didn't actually participate in the battle. It suffered no casualties. The Union command held the 121st in reserve on this entire time, reducing its troops to observers. They sat up at the top of the hill, they watched Pickett's charge come, they described it, it was beautiful, but they never participated. This reflects the randomness of war and combat. And while Joshua Chamberlain was saving the Union left just a few yards away, the 121st wasn't even committed. But because the Gettysburg and the New York Monuments Commission decided that Gettysburg battlefield would be the permanent monument to the Union war effort, and because multiple memorials really were beyond the means of the average soldier, the men of the 121st Regimental Association joined with the rest to stake their claim to immortality at Gettysburg, rather than, let's say, Fredericksburg, where they first fought, or Salem Church, where they incurred tremendous, terrible losses. They didn't memorialize their courageous attack at the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania, and they didn't memorialize their defeat and then victory at Cedar Creek in the Shenandoah Valley. They chose not to even remember Petersburg or the siege at Rappahannock Station or Sailor's Creek, where in the latter 2 instances they captured battle flags and a lot of Confederate soldiers. Although the monument remains a tribute to the regiment and provides a capsule history of its exploits, the real story of the 121st is in different libraries, archives in Albany and in Washington, and through museums scattered throughout the country. And one of those is a depository in New York, the New York State Military Museum in Saratoga, New York, where this remnant of a national flag resides. It was acquired by the regiment in the fall of 1863, and it bears the unimaginable ravages of battle which the regiment suffered through Grant's overland campaign during the spring and summer of 1864. Again, an irony. And the irony is that only the words Salem and May appear, and down at the bottom, Rappahannock, which stands for Rappahannock Station, November 7th. That's all that remains. Salem Church was the regiment's baptism under fire, where they probably walked into an ambush, although no one ever called it that. And they lost nearly half of the regiment in that battle. I'm going to take you through it very quickly in order to understand it. I get in a lot of controversy with some of my colleagues. There were 4 actions that occurred at the Chancellorsville campaign. It started as a pincer movement. North of the Rappahannock, Hooker decided that he would cross at U.S. Ford right here and catch Lee, cross the Rappahannock River, right here. Over here is Fredericksburg. You can't see it on this map. Cross the Rappahannock and engage Lee coming in from behind. Sedgwick, with the 121st New York, was to come up below Fredericksburg and travel this way and pinch Lee in between. Well, a lot of things went wrong with both Lee and with Hooker. Hooker got very good at the beginning. He managed to make some headway until Jackson took his troops in this direction. A lot of Federal scouts were watching the troops as they began heading west and decided that Jackson was going to leave the field. He was retreating. What he was doing was preparing to come right back around and slam the 11th Corps, Howard's Corps over here around Chancellorsville, and completely routed the Federals, pushing Hooker into a U shape here on the about May 2nd on the Rappahannock. In the meantime, Sedgwick, with the 121st, was coming up this way below Fredericksburg. He left the 121st in reserve once again, and he marched through Fredericksburg with great casualties. They encountered Barksdale's Mississippians at the same place that Burnside tried to capture on Mary's Heights. They drove through them with great loss, and they all got together again approximately at this location here. The 121st was held below. Now, you see what this says? It says Union soldiers in Petersburg. And I was so delighted to find this before the book was published. A colleague, Earl Hess, who has written books on Civil War entrenchments, has re-identified this photograph. And he maintains that this photograph is of the 1st Division of Sedgwick's Corps, and it probably shows Bartlett's brigade in Brooks's 1st Division. We may be looking at faces of the 121st on the morning of Sunday, May 3rd, before it headed toward Salem Church. Salem Church was their baptism of fire. I had words with another Civil War historian who said, well, we don't call it Salem Church, we call it Banks Ford. Well, I can tell you that you saw the flag, and I've read a lot of diaries, an awful lot of letters, and they never once referred to it as Banks Ford. They always talked about Salem Church. As a matter of fact, when they were fighting at Rappahannock Station 6 months later, one of the guys yelled out when they went to attack the Confederates, remember Salem Church. He didn't yell out, remember Banks Ford. Here's Brooks, here's Upton, and the 121st right here. Here's the Orange Plank Road. Chancellorsville is that way. What started out to be a pincer movement with Sedgwick and Hooker coming together was a pitiful rescue effort by Sedgwick. He got directives from Hooker saying, please come to my aid. And so what did he do? He pulls his whole corps together and he starts heading toward Chancellorsville, which is in that direction. Hooker's hunkered down up there, and he runs into Wilcox's, Semmes, and Kershaw there. What's not shown on this map is there was a road here with ditches on either side of it. And the Confederates were in the ditches, waiting for these guys to come through. And you can see what an awful situation this is, because you don't know where you are. By the time you get here through the woods, you're almost on top of your enemy. You don't have a long field of fire or observation to deal with. The minute they came out of the side of the woods, the rebels got up and fired at them and killed probably a third of the regiment, or maybe 20% of them. Many of them were wounded. What happened after that was the battle lasted 20 minutes, and they pulled back. There is, not shown on this map, a toll house where they finally regrouped. Upton came and pulled his troops together. Some of them had been captured. Many of them were still missing. The troops were in disarray, and the next day, going back to that first map, we find Sedgwick holed up here in a big U shape around Banks Ford, while Hooker's up there. The two of them are sitting there on the river like this with their backs to the river, and by the 5th of May, Lee had pushed them back over the Rappahannock by the will of God, he said. He got rid of them all, and that ended that. Rappahannock Station was another story. It was a much simpler operation. Upton led a famous charge here after Ellmaker attacked the rebel forces here in entrenchments. Again, this is the Rappahannock here. The rebels were on the north side of the river. The Union came in on the north side, and at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when Lee thought that they weren't going to attack at all, he thought the main attack was coming farther down the road, farther down the river at Kelly's Ford. He assumed that Sedgwick was not going to attack him. Well, in a brilliant nighttime maneuver, these two elements fell on the Confederates here, pushing them back into the river. A lot of guys had to swim for their lives. Some of them drowned. For the North, the battle was a complete and glorious victory. 1,600 rebel troops surrendered to them. They captured about 10, 11 flags. It was a complete and glorious victory. This is what Meade needed after Gettysburg. This is Rappahannock Station, November 1863. Meade has been chasing Lee for the entire summer and finally caught up with him here at Rappahannock Station. Rappahannock Station doesn't exist anymore. It's the town of Remington, and getting a good map of this is very difficult. General Wright noted that it was the first instance in which Union troops had carried a strong entrenched Confederate position in the first assault. Perhaps the biggest praise, though, came from Harry Hayes, the Confederate general, who claimed to have been attacked by no less than 20 to 25,000 Union soldiers, figured 10 times the actual number. The battle had been humiliating for the South, as it had been as glorious for the North. Two of the Confederacy's finest brigades, sheltered behind entrenchments and well supported by artillery, had been routed and captured by an enemy force of equal size. Colonel Walter Taylor of Lee's staff called it the saddest chapter in the history of this army, the result of miserable, miserable management. An enlisted soldier put it more plainly. I don't know much about it, he said, but it seems to me that our army was surprised. Where did these guys come from? They came from the 20th Senatorial District. It's called the State Senatorial District. They answered Lincoln's call for 300,000 more to meet Lee's threats in mid-year 1862. The states, counties, and towns set up a crazy quilt pattern of bounties to entice young men to enlist. These men joined the Civil War effort at the end of the first phase of what I call the first phase, the first phase of patriotism, flag waving, banners, picnics, parades, into the second phase that happened right after Antietam, when Alexander Gardner's pictures showed up in New York showing the exact devastation of the war. That's when they joined, in the September of '62. They came from Herkimer County and Otsego County. Herkimer, Otsego, Herkimer, Otsego. The modern technology is wonderful, isn't it? I learned how to do that. I think it's cool. I could sit here and watch this all day. Now, pay attention here, too, to this whole western end. The Finger Lakes are about here. This whole western end, I'm going to refer to that later when I get to Emory-Upton. Okay, you know where they came from now. Right smack dab in the middle of the state. Herkimer County thrusts up into the Adirondacks. Both of these counties sit in the foothills of the Adirondacks and the Catskills. The northern part of Herkimer County is Wilmert. There's nobody living there. They didn't live there in those days, and they don't live there now. If you've ever been in the Adirondacks, you'll know it's very, very bleak, but it's beautiful. All right, here's the main part of Herkimer County. And the most interesting feature of Herkimer County is right through the bottom of it goes the Mohawk River, the Central Railroad now, the Erie Canal, and all of the traffic, east-west traffic through here. And this changed or made up the complex of the people of Herkimer. And it brought in diversity. It brought in all kinds of changes that perhaps Otsego County, and I'll get into that in a minute. These guys joined after the urge of patriotism had fallen. They had to sign up with bounties. And what happened was all of these little states, these towns and villages began offering a patchwork quilt, and we talk about it in the book, of bounties. And as a matter of fact, when they got into the field, the guys who were already in the field referred to them as $200 sons of bitches because they accepted bounties to come to fight for the Union. They enlisted and were recruited. They were led by the officers who had recruited them. They came from laboring classes. They were farmers, mechanics, mill hands. Officers, by contrast, were predominantly community leaders in the towns and villages, and they usually held influential positions like lawyers. Some were teachers, merchants, municipal officials, ministers, doctors, and the like. And students fell into both groups. There were students who were officers and students who were enlisted men. Some were older and mature enough to lead in combat. And I argue that the bounties were problematic because they produced bounty jumpers, they produced deserters, and a fierce competition between the towns and villages in order to meet their quotas. And that led to desertion. Now, Herkimer County, I pretty much explained it. It was founded in the 17th century by Germans from the Palatinate. It's known for dairying and succulent cheeses. It had a unique quality to it in that it had an institution called Fairfield Academy or Seminary. This was an incredibly liberal or progressive school that taught classical curriculum. And many of the officers and many of the men from Herkimer County had attended Fairfield, and it influenced very heavily their outlook on emancipation, on slavery, on their attitudes toward the black man, freed or slave. On the other side of the ledger, Herkimer County men deserted at a far greater rate than the Otsego County guys did. And they boasted the only man, an officer, to be booted out of the regiment. He was Dr. Stephen B. Valentine of Schuyler, Herkimer County. He signed a medical discharge paper for another Herkimer soldier for the sum of $150. It was a bribe. Otsego County, on the other hand, is more isolated. It's more rural. It's more agrarian. It's known for hops instead of cheese. It's known for its hops crops that were cultivated well into the 20th century, as late as the 1920s. It wasn't as progressive, and the attitudes of the inhabitants were markedly and decidedly more anti-emancipation. And they were led in part by the Freeman's Journal, and I'll talk about the newspapers in a second. The Emancipation Proclamation enraged the Freeman's Journal, whose editors understood it to mean unconditional surrender and no peace talks. They cited the section of the proclamation that spoke directly to the slaves and wondered how a group of people who could not read would benefit from what they called a joke and a miserable humbug. They viewed the proclamation as a victory for the Republican radicals who had lobbied for the measure since the war began. In their estimation, in the Freeman's Journal's estimation, the proclamation would only prolong the war. Now victory consisted of complete domination by the Southern people, and if the new strategy failed, they asked rhetorically, whose fault is it? On whom rests the responsibility and the shame? They answered their own question on the weak and incompetent, and in bold letters, capital letters, Abraham Lincoln. Cooperstown is the center of Otsego County. It was founded by William Cooper. He was a Quaker. He was a judge from New Jersey. He cashed in on all the land that became available after the Revolution, and he founded Cooperstown. It was the home in 1862, and this is exactly the summer of 1862 when this lithograph was produced. It had 2,400 people. When my wife and I lived there in 1973, it still had 2,400 people. This picture captures the idyllic setting and its geographical location at the bottom of the Lake Otsego. It shows the headwaters of the Susquehanna, which flow all the way down to Harper's Ferry. And for many years, and still is, Cooperstown was the watering hole of a lot of famous and rich people from New York City. Well, more than 1,800 men actually served in the ranks of the 121st. I'm going to focus on two of them. I'm not going to keep you here all night. This is Samuel Burdett Kelly, K-E-L-L-E-Y, from Otsego County. have a representative from Herkimer County also. His story rivals the fictional Cold Mountain, if you're familiar with the book and you're familiar with the movie. He came from a family of 5 in Skenevis, which is over the mountain from Cooperstown in Otsego County. He had 2 sisters. He started work in a dry goods store, but he wanted to move to the big city. So he got a job in Cooperstown, the big city, 2,400 people. And he worked in a dry goods store there on Main Street. He joined the Army in 1862 over his father's and his family's objections. He was wounded at Salem Church, May 3rd, 1863. He survived only to be captured at the Wilderness a year later, May 5th, 1864. He was sent here to Macon, which is the prisoner of war camp for officers. He contracted diarrhea, was moved to Savannah in advance of Sherman's oncoming troops, and then he went to Charleston in December, where he was ministered to by the Sisters of Charity. He was finally paroled to a military hospital in Annapolis, Maryland, where his health gyrated. One day he was fit to be discharged. The next day he was dying. In the meantime, his father had joined the Army and was stationed out west in Minnesota. Throughout January of 1865, his mother was torn to be beside him. She would get letters from his nurse saying he's dying, and then she'd get a letter a couple of weeks later, he's doing all right. She didn't know. She had two girls left at home. But she finally decided to head for Annapolis, and she instructed her daughters to prepare a room for him in their house up there in Skenevis, make sure they had a fireplace all warm for him with quilts and covers, and she arrived at his side January 20th in Annapolis. When the doctors finally gave her permission to move him, she readied him for the trip home. He got worse, and then he got better, so she finally got him out of there by the end of January. She took him on a train from Annapolis to Cobleskill, New York, which is just north of Skenevis, and it's northeast of Cooperstown. There she got a wagon. She put him in blankets, protect him from the bitter New York winter. She put him in a horse-drawn wagon, and they took the trip to Skenevis. By February, he was home in the bosom of his family. There, attended by his mothers and sisters at the age of 23, he died of chronic diarrhea, February 16th, 1865, 2 months before the war's end. In Cooperstown, where he had attended store, the Freeman's Journal, once again, ran a short obituary that referenced rebel slaughter pens where he endured all the privations, sufferings. That's not the end of the story. His family disintegrated, literally, at war's end. When his father was discharged from the Army, he came back, returned home to Skenevis. He was unscathed physically, but he complained after the war, as all these guys did, of something. That's the way they got their pensions. But he claimed his eyesight was failing and he couldn't find work. Soon after that, he began to abuse his wife, Mary Ann, this guy's mother. She instituted divorce proceedings, which dragged on for several bitter months and went all the way to the New York State Supreme Court, which granted her a divorce in January of 1868. Then she went through 3 or 4 years trying to get a pension based on his service or her husband's service, and the government turned her down because of both of them for various reasons. She wasn't able to depend on her husband for support. She became destitute, and after her divorce and all these attempts, she disappeared from the historical record except for occasional appearances as a member of temperance organizations in or near Skenevis. This fella came from Herkimer County. He's one of 5 children. His parents were German. Who spoke no English. He did. He went to Fairfield Academy that I mentioned earlier. He took a classical course of study. And his letters home from the field had to be translated into German so his parents could understand them. And then when he got letters from home in German, he had to find a guy who could speak German in the regiment to translate the letters to him, for him. He served out throughout the entire war until the Shenandoah campaign, where in the fall of '64, he vanished without a trace at the Battle of Cedar Creek, October 19, 1864. His sister worked tirelessly to find out what had happened to him. She heard stories that he had been captured and sent to Andersonville here. She heard stories that he had been wounded and sent to Andersonville, where he probably died. She wrote to his comrades, his comrades, to find out what had happened to him. Some of them said he died. Some of them said he never made it. Some of them said he was captured. I saw him in line at Andersonville, some of them wrote back. One soldier told her she always supposed William was killed at the Battle of Cedar Creek. He had never seen him at Andersonville. Another company mate knew his brother, insisted that he had not been taken prisoner and he died on the field. The Remmel family was referred again to Washington, where they received no answers. The Christian Commission, after searching its records, suggested that William might have been wounded and sent to a hospital, but his company commander, John Kidder, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, was certain he'd been killed in action and had not languished. She persisted into the 20th century trying to find out what happened to her brother, and she finally gave up about 1911. And she said if he had survived, he'd cherish towards the Southern soldier the same kindly, warm, loving, and magnanimous spirit that is cherished by the survivors of the blue and the gray. This is Richard Francho. He's the first commander. I'm going to take you to the three commanders they had. He's from an old New York family. He served as a congressman from 1861 to 1863. He was a one-time congressman, one-termer. His family went back, as I said, to the 18th century. He came from Morris, New York. Good Republican, good friend of Governor Morgan. And he raised 1,000 men in 2 months. He was a great organizer and a lousy leader. He tried to raise a regiment earlier in the war, and he was unsuccessful. He lasted less than 1 month in the field, and he nearly killed the regiment. Nearly half the regiment ended up in hospitals, private homes, and barns in September, the first month in the field in 1862. They suffered from dysentery and diarrhea, and he was hated by many, but not all of them. His greatest critic, and there's been a whole book done on this guy, is the assistant surgeon, Daniel Holt, who was, in today's terminology, a piece of work. On September 5th, he reported a near revolt that was attributed to hunger. According to the good doctor, the men had not drawn rations for 3 days. Holt himself, however, survived this temporary setback with cakes supplied by his wife, packed before he left for the front. I thought that was great. His criticism continued unabated. He called Francho the worst commander ever imposed on a regiment. This guy was 6 feet tall, by the way. The fact the regiment had left all its necessary equipment behind as it quit Fort Lincoln, headed up to Antietam, infuriated the doctor, who complained that the situation occurred because of the consummate ignorant folly of a man whose brains were anywhere but in his head. Holt railed against the forced marches with no enemy in sight and about how the unrelenting, rigorous physical demands harmed the untrained troops. His name became a reproach and stench among the men of his command, which pretty strong words. He finally went back to Congress, and one guy said, he probably preferred a seat in Congress to the one in the saddle. We're slipping by time here, I can see. I'm not going to be able to get through everything. It's very difficult, as you will find out, to get it down to 40 minutes. This is Emory Upton, and I think this is a good place to spend a little time. He was from that district in western New York called the Burned Over District. It was called the Burned Over District because, and this is important to understand him, it was the scene of the Second Awakening, the Great Revival period in American history. And he and his family became swept up in Methodism and anti-slavery, abolitionism, and the Great Awakening, the religious revival that occurred in the Burned Over District. And this influenced him when he went to Oberlin for a while, and then when he went on to West Point in 1856. He came from a large family of 10 children. His brother, as a matter of fact, served with the 121st and reported to him. There have been two biographies done of Upton, one in 1885 by Peter Mickey, who wrote a book called Life and Letters of Emory Upton. That was very celebratory. There was another one done by Stephen Ambrose in 1964 called Upton in the Army, which was kind of picked up off of the first book. He's in desperate need of a full biography. But look at that face, will you? 22 years old, high cheekbones, ruddy complexion, auburn hair. He's right out of Central Casting in Hollywood. When I saw that picture, I thought, geez, you know, Mickey Rooney could play that part. Not now, but a long time ago. He had a remarkable career. He served in, look at him on the left there. He's a young lieutenant in the artillery. That's his first job. They said that he sighted the first cannon at the Battle of Bull Run. But one thing you learn about Emory Upton is that every time he got a promotion, and he was ambitious from day one, from leaving the West Point Academy, he had his picture taken every time he got a new rank. And I could tell from this picture, if you look very closely, he's got a lieutenant's bars, he's second lieutenant, artillery, probably right after Bull Run, but right after he got his promotion to lieutenant. I mean, he looks like a little boy. The next picture, which is in the book, shows him as a colonel of the 121st, and we think this was probably taken in September or October of 1862, just before he accepted command of the 121st in the field. He got his picture taken again when he got his stars after Spotsylvania. General Martin McMahon came to him before he led that famous charge of 12 hand-picked regiments into the Mule Shoe. He said to him, "If you survive," which is a great way to start a conversation, "if you survive, you will get a star." And I think he did. He looks battle-weary right there. The second picture is taken between 1870 and 1875 when he was the commandant of West Point. He'd been a cadet, and now he was a commandant. And the last picture is him in France. After the war, he became the expert on American military policy. He traveled all over the world. He reviewed military policies in China, India, you name it. He wrote several treatises on it. The country wasn't in a mood to listen to him at the time because there was no war on the horizon. He wanted to reform the military. He was very depressed by this. He was writing a book on tactics when he was the commandant of the Presidio in 1881, and there he committed suicide. He was 42 years old. I mean, but he looks very much older in this picture taken in France. The last commander, and I think I'll leave it at this. I've got so much more, but there's no way I'm going to get through it. I love this guy's name, Egbert Olcott. If you think Egbert is a great name, he had a daughter he named Egberta. I kid you not. He is probably the most interesting guy of the three commanders that there is. He came from Cherry Valley, where that's a little village outside of Cooperstown. It was famous in the 1970s and 60s, 1960s and 70s, when you smoked pot and drank a lot in Cherry Valley, where all the hippies lived. But he came from there. His father was upwardly mobile. He loved to socialize, and he loved to drink, too heavily at times. He was court-martialed by Upton during the winter quarters of 63-64 for initiating a drunken brawl that involved enlisted men and officers at a Christmas party. And I go into great detail in the book about it if you want to read that. The winter quarters for the officers in 63-64 were grander and better than anything anybody could imagine, especially Egbert Olcott's. He designed and constructed a Gothic structure for his quarters, and it was outfitted with the best of everything. As the local papers said, it excels anything in the Army. Olcott's quarters are made of straight poles hewn on one side, laid up like a log cabin, and on. Commodious, elegant, nicely furnished inside. This is winter quarters in Virginia. He commandeered carpenters from the regiment who would rather work on his quarters than to clean up the latrines in camp all winter long, and I would too. One of his mates was in his quarters at one time, and this is a guy by the name of Delavan Bates, and Bates wanted to be just like Olcott. And he said, I was there once in his quarters, and it was enough to leave a picture in my mind, he wrote later. The floor was neatly carpeted, a comfortable cot, an easy chair, a couple of camp chairs, and a center table, upon which was a full set of Christopher North's Noctes Ambrosiana, elegantly bound. How I wish that someday I would be a major and live in such a style as that. Bates envied Olcott's library. He said he always had a supply of choice literature in his tent. Well, Bates compared Olcott to Upton when he remembered, outside of the art of war, he was probably in all respects the equal of Colonel Upton. But whereas Upton was temperate, rigid, God-fearing, and a strict disciplinarian, Alcott had learned the ways of a man of the world. As a social animal with natural instincts, he would belly up to the bar with the best of them. As a result, Alcott was far better adapted to meet the demands of society, and especially at the festive gatherings, which sometimes are indulged in by congenial spirits, Bates remembered. Alcott's sartorial tendencies were well documented. His taste in dress was as refined as that of any lady, Bates wrote, and not a wrinkle could ever be seen upon his elegant uniform. Although Alcott commanded the regiment longer than anybody else, quite frankly, the regiment never warmed up to him as they did to Upton. The regiment never changed its name to Alcott's Regulars. I have a lot more to tell you and a lot more to show you, but I'm going to close now with the words of a drummer boy, Henry Wood. The regiment lived on for 60 years afterwards. They finally wrote their history. Here's a copy of it. In 1921. The world has completely changed by then. It was a remarkably different place. We'd fought 2 more wars by the time they got this book out. But get it out they did. There were very few people left to buy it because most of the survivors were dead. As a matter of fact, the 3 guys who wrote this book lived about 5 years after that. But the last survivor I was able to find was the drummer boy. And his name was Henry Wood. And he died in 1937. And it's with a description of his homecoming I'd like to close. The 3 Wood brothers took the train back to Herkimer County and got off at the station in Herkimer. There they hired a light wagon to take them to Cooperstown, where they arrived at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Once in Cooperstown, they began the 3-mile walk to their home in Middlefield. They left their baggage in a Cooperstown store, but Henry clung to the drum he'd carried through the war. After they had walked a mile, Henry noticed the dust kicked up by an approaching wagon, and after a while he realized that his father had driven out to meet them. As the elder Wood drew closer, he recognized his boys and whipped the team to full speed. Once all 3 had climbed into the wagon and exchanged tearful greetings, Henry Wood remembered, "We saw the light in his eyes, which we are sure had not been there for a long time." It was a gleam of gladness and thankfulness that the boys had come home safe and as well as could be expected under the circumstances. Even the horses looked around as though they understood that something unusual was happening. The elder Wood had driven to Cooperstown 3 times that day. Didn't have blackberries then. Not knowing when his boys would finally arrive. He dropped the elder brother James off at his home to be united with his wife and family. "We did not remain to see the meeting that was too sacred," he wrote. "But we hurried on home." Henry recalled how many times during the war he had dreamed of home with every detail. The table set, the white tablecloth, and so much good food, only to awake cold, miserable, hungry, and still tired. Now Henry's dream had at long last come true. When he saw his mother standing near the house just beyond the fence, he jumped out of the wagon before it stopped. He hopped the fence and embraced her once again. As he wrote of the moment nearly 70 years later, he admitted that the sacred scene brought tears to his eyes, and the overflow drops on the paper and blots my writing. That evening he played his drum for family and friends until he was exhausted. He fell into bed, the first bed he had slept in 3 years. "We appeared to be living in a new world," he wrote. "Gone were the noises of other voices and the violent sounds of war. The simple act of sitting in a chair at a table became a meaningful, joyous experience." Henry took his accumulated pay from Uncle Sam and he went out and bought civilian clothes. On the following Sunday, he went to Sunday school with his brother John, where his neighbor Lyman Smith introduced the Woods brothers as heroes. We were not used to that and hardly knew what to say. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to take them. Covered everything, huh? Yes, ma'am.
I think you said Oswego County was anti-emancipation in general?
I found
Cooperstown was Quaker.
Cooperstown was very, very liberal, and it still is today, as opposed to the surrounding areas. And having lived there, I can see the differences. Yeah, it was an oasis, quite frankly, in the middle of that.
So their feelings didn't spread to the rest of the
No. If you've ever read the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, it really applies to what was going on in these two counties at this particular time. In Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, he talks about the transmission of culture across east to west. And boy, if this wasn't a perfect example of that. Yes, sir.
Are there any articles on Emory Upton in his later years, especially his depression and
Yes.
relation like the PTSD or whatever?
Yes. The question is, do I know of any articles? Yeah, I found a ton of them in the medical literature. And as I point out in the book, they up until recently said that Emory Upton suffered from a brain tumor, and I found medical evidence to the contrary. He suffered what was known as a mucocele, and that is merely a pouch of mucosa, which is in your nose. He went to a doctor in Philadelphia to have his nose cauterized. Can you imagine a hot poker up your nose? And that didn't work. And he had this brown, ugly phlegm that he would constantly produce that would drain into his throat. And maybe I took liberties in the book, but I said when he committed suicide, he went up to his room at the Presidio and he put his pistol in his mouth and he pulled the trigger. And it was almost metaphorical, almost symbolic, maybe real, that he was trying to get rid of that thing in his nose that was driving him absolutely crazy. One of the medical doctors who has written a modern article on Upton's medical condition uses the term mucocele, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Not a brain tumor at all. Yes?
What town in Western New York was he from?
Batavia, New York. They were really helpful to me, by the way. I mentioned Peter Mickey's book of 1885. This is an interesting, quick research story. Mickey's book took Upton's letters, and he condensed them, he edited them, and he published them in the book, okay? For years, Upton's letters were lost. I got an email about 3 or 4 years ago from a guy in Connecticut that said, the Museum of Batavia has just gotten Emory Upton's letters. You better contact them. And they were so nice to me. They sent me discs of all of Upton's letters that the family had had for years, and nobody knew about them anymore. So I got the first shot at these. And I looked at them, and oh my God, you look at the pictures of the letters, and there are blue lines on both sides and coming across. These were the letters that Mickey used in the book on Upton's letters, and you can see where he twisted history for us a little bit, and having access to the real letters helped me set the record straight on really what Upton meant when he wrote the letters. Yes, sir. That was fun.
You wrote your thesis on the same subject.
Yes.
How did you develop your interest in the 121st? Did you have a
No. I graduated from the Cooperstown graduate programs in 1970, and we were required to write a thesis. And you had 3 choices. You could write a thesis on museum administration, history of museum administration, which I thought would be boring, and I've done it now for 40 years and it's not. You could write one on folk life, and I wasn't too interested in that. And they said you could write one on history, and I said, well, I've always been interested in the Civil War. What's the deal? I went to see a book dealer up in Cooperstown, and he was a curmudgeonly old fellow by the name of, he had a famous name. His brother was a Butterfield. And his brother was Fox Butterfield, who used to write for the New York Times. He was an antique book dealer. And he kind of took a liking to me, and he gave me a copy of the book, of the 121st. And I said, man, that's cool. And so when you write a thesis, you can't travel very far. So all the records that I had at the time were right there. I'd go up to the Herkimer County Historical Society or to Albany or someplace, and I could pull together material that my good wife typed over and over again as a thesis for many years after that. But we finally got it done. You know, it was 40 years ago. And I always said I wanted to write a book on this regiment, and I put it away for 33 years. And 7 years ago, I decided that time to do it. Yes. Yes, sir.
What happened on the Confederate side with General Early? They were surprised. They were so well entrenched.
You mean at Rappahannock Station?
Yeah.
Or at Salem Church?
Let's see.
Early was against them both at Cedar Creek and in the Shenandoah campaign, and also Early's men were in Fredericksburg at Salem Church. And I didn't get a chance to go into that, but when you go back and look at the map, you can see where over here, when Sedgwick came up and hit Fredericksburg, Early was pushed back this way. And talk about stupid. Sedgwick pushes him this way, and he goes this way to Hooker's relief, and what happens? Early comes in behind him. So that's why he had to hole up here on the river.
And then the surprise attack at 9, the next.
At Rappahannock Station? Yeah, Rappahannock Station was a lot longer than I described it. But the Confederates were entrenched right here in front of the river. Instead of being behind the river, they were on top of the river. And that was a big mistake Lee made. He thought he could hold it here. He also thought that Kelly's Ford was going to be the force of the Union attack, and he didn't think Sedgwick was going to do anything here. He thought Sedgwick was a diversion like he had been earlier at Salem Church. It's interesting, you know. Any other? Yes, sir.
Two questions. First of all, you mentioned the book dealer by the name of Butterfield.
Yeah.
Is he in relation to General Butterfield?
I think he was. Yeah, I think he was.
The other one is Sedgwick's successor, Horatio Wright.
Yes.
I know he was never as popular as Sedgwick, but some of the men of 6-4 thought he was okay and others hated him. What are the men of 121st think about Wright?
Modern computers, man. There he is, General Horatio Wright. They loved him. They absolutely loved him. After the war, Egbert Alcott, wanted to be a real soldier. He wanted to go in the regular army, and he petitioned Wright. And Wright used to write glowing reports about Alcott, both at Salem Church, not Salem Church, but Rappahannock Station, later on in the Shenandoah campaign, and then when they got back to Petersburg, and then Salem Creek. I didn't even get into all that. But this is a picture of Wright that it's a glass plate negative from the Library of Congress. It's been broken, obviously, but this appeared after the war on a stereograph for the soldiers to buy to see their old comrade. And there's an inscription on the back of this stereograph, not necessarily in the back of this. It says, "The old Sixth Corps were too well known to send any survivors of that brave organization will be glad to take a look at their old commander, General flag, which could be always found where the fight was the hottest." They liked him. I didn't find any to the contrary. Any other questions? Well, thank you. You've been wonderful. Appreciate it.